Welcome to part one of a series of talks on the flow of consciousness in literature. So, writing, reading, viewing art and literature are enjoyable and charming and entertaining, and certainly anything that good must be good for you, must change you, must culture your state of consciousness. So let me narrow my words to poetry, simply because it's much easier to read and comment on a poem in a short talk than on a whole story or novel. What is a poem? Some say that it's writing that doesn't reach the end of the page. Not so funny, actually, because those empty spaces you see, those silences on the page, so to speak, affect the consciousness of the reader. Or if we pause when we read a poem, when we come to the end of a line, to an empty space, these silences affect the consciousness of the listener. There's so many things important in poetry. Sound, rhythm, meaning, structure, many things. But let's just focus in on silence for a bit. Where does poetry come from? It must come from our own inner silence, from the source of speech within. It may be triggered by an external event or something we see, but the words arise from within, right? Now, in the mid to late 1970s, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi occasionally talked about poetry and literature in general, usually in response to a talk given by a professor of literature, often at a symposium with experts in many academic and professional fields. Here's a picture of Maharishi shaking hands with Buckminster Fuller. You can look for that on YouTube and hear his remarks about Maharishi and something of their interaction. Now, in a talk that Maharishi gave called Poetry and the Veda, he said that all the aspects of a piece of writing come together in a very beautiful, connected manner if there is silence deep within. Now, by silence, Maharishi meant that state, very near or even at the state of least excitation of consciousness. From that place, he says, on this wide and silent, yet lively bed of silence, in a very wide range of comprehension, in the conscious awareness of the poet, the whole structure of the poem starts to be built. I have transcribed this and a number of other talks and put them in a volume with my colleague Susan Anderson that we call The Flow of Consciousness, because Maharishi says that literature is the flow of consciousness, the flow of life, the flow of nature, the flow of infinity, totality. And he says, if a poem originates in the silent depths of the mind, then the essential force of a work of literature lies, he says, in the purity of the writer, in the purity of the consciousness of the writer, who is able to bring in an ocean in a drop, to see the ocean in a drop. Now, many poets would agree. Now, when a poet writes about how and where poetry comes from, he or she often calls such a poem poetics. So here's one such poem by a modern American poet, A.R. Ammons. I'm going to pause just a little bit extra at the end of the lines as I read, so you can be aware of those silences on the page, those gaps on the page. Don't strain. Meaning is very easy to get. Just enjoy the flow of images and sounds. Now, by the way, some recent research on what happens to the brain when you read or listen to a work of literature, as opposed to plain text, without images, textures, metaphors, colors, is that your brain lights up in many places. The images, colors, textures stimulate different areas of the brain. So experiencing literature is a much more involving, holistic, enlivening experience than reading, say, a manual on how to do something. This is recent research. Okay, so here we go. This is Poetics by A.R. Ammons. I look for the way things will turn out, spiraling from a center. The shape things will take to come forth in, so that the birch tree white touched black at the branches will stand out, wind glittering, totally its apparent self. I look for the forms things want to come as. From what black wells of possibility, how a thing will unfold. Not the shape on paper, though that too, but the uninterfering means on paper. Not so much looking for the shape as being available to any shape that may be summoning itself through me from the self not mine, but ours. So here is the poet not only telling you that the poem, the shape and the form and the texture of it, come not so much from him as through him, from some deep silent place, he calls it well of possibility, that seems not to be just his own personal inner silence, but perhaps a silence common to us all, something much more unbounded and universal. So with these pauses and surprises that sometimes come, something you're not expecting one word to follow, that one at the end of one sentence and a word comes to the beginning of the next, you weren't expecting that, so it's kind of a surprise. And what happens is, it invites us to transcend into our, as much as we're capable, our own deeper silences. And as much as we are able to transcend those grosser levels of the mind and slip inward, we do. And did you feel your consciousness expand at the end there to take in that more holistic notion of the self, not mine, but ours? Now, if you're practicing the transcendental meditation technique, so you're used to slipping inward, aren't you? But the way has been greased for you by repeated practice, so to speak. So in you go. But maybe you are a natural transcender and you slip inward anyway. So we'll talk more about that in part 2 in the series when we focus on the reader and the reader state of consciousness. Now, here's how the 19th century British poet William Wordsworth describes how his poetry comes out. This is a kind of his poetics, and it's embedded in his very long poem, which is known as Tintern Abbey. So Wordsworth had been out for several days in the English countryside, and now he's back in his rooms in London, and he's remembering the sights and sounds of nature. And he says these remembered or reconstructed experiences give him a great deal of solace and pleasure. It's a long passage I'm going to read you, but it's very easy to follow. He says he owes to these reconstructed memories or re-experienced memories not just solace and pleasure, but something deeper and more integrative. He calls it a gift. To them I may have owed another gift of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on until the breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. So Wordsworth is describing the mind settling down, his breathing settling down. He even feels the motion of his blood slowing down, almost suspended, he says. And the sound of that actually, almost suspended, kind of sounds like something slowing down by subtle steps, almost suspended. While the inner eye is silenced by harmony, by joy, he says, we can see into the life of things. Did you feel some settling down as I read those lines? I think the pauses after each carefully worded line allow the reader or listener to slide into a deeper inner silence as well. And the phrases that follow those pauses are sometimes surprising, and they stimulate the mind to expand, to experience more. Even the motion of our human blood almost suspended. Now, no one was going to think that their blood was going to be almost suspended. So that's kind of a little bit of a surprise. We are laid asleep, he says, in body and become a living soul. Again, something different. And remember, Ammons too uses those same techniques to tease the mind into new territory after his pauses. So this was Wordsworth's technique. He used these memories, these re-experiences, to help him transcend the surface levels of the mind, to get to his own inner self, to a state of harmony and joy, he says, asleep in body, but alive in consciousness, and he could see into the life of things. Now, after some years passed, he was no longer able to use these memories to evoke his own inner silence and to lead his consciousness inward, and his great poetry dates from these periods when he could do this. Just think if he had had a technique for going inward that would have lasted him his entire life, would have been a good thing. Now, a slightly lighter look at the whole thing. Here's a poem called Menopausal Poetics. Wordsworth composed Tintern Abbey on a 50-mile walk and kept it in his head until he could write it all down. I, on the other hand, find myself in a room, staring blankly, wondering what I meant to do there. Or, in the middle of a thought, I am overcome by waves of heat, flooding out every memory and leaving me damp and dazed. My only hope is to hasten to the keyboard, fresh from meditation, to quickly capture those evanescent murmurs that sprout, unfold, and softly stream throughout the fading light as I lie silent, full of grace, after that inward journey home. So, from the perspective of a writer, it's important to develop one's consciousness, to cultivate that inner silence, to develop that broad comprehension necessary to write great poetry, and to allow the creative forces to flow outward spontaneously from there. Now, research on the Transcendental Meditation technique shows that it increases creativity and intelligence, cognitive flexibility, and develops emotional intelligence. That's a good one. Who doesn't want to be more emotionally intelligent? Sign me up. We can only speculate on how practicing the Transcendental Meditation technique for a few minutes morning and evening can do that. All that is a side effect or byproduct of just sitting quietly without thinking about being creative or intelligent. Perhaps it's just the repeated soaking of one's mind in that inner silence that cultivates and creates these effects. So Maharishi has a great deal more to say about the writer and writing. You might enjoy reading some of his talks in the book. And so this brings us to the end of part 1, which is focused on the writer and the silence out of which creativity creates. And in the next part, I'm going to talk about the reader state of consciousness, and the 7 states of consciousness, which are very important for the reading and understanding of literature.